The victory of the new president of Argentina, Javier Milay, was probably the main political sensation of the end of 2023. Moreover, even during the election campaign, he was quite often compared to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The reasons for such parallels were self-evident. Although Milay was not a professional artist, he was famous for his flooring and resorted to well-directed theatrical performances, which are very familiar to Ukrainians. Xavier waved a real chainsaw at rallies, promising to deal with corrupt officials as harshly as possible after his election. And this was like 2 drops of water reminiscent of Zelensky's election videos. In addition, Milay positioned himself as a supporter of radical libertarian reforms aimed at saving costs. In his campaign speeches, he promised to replace the devalued peso with the dollar, and almost threatened to abolish the state as such, because it is necessary to spend serious sums on the maintenance of ministries and agencies, which allegedly cannot be afforded by the government. And most importantly, the new Argentine president did not hide his sympathies for the United States. While most other Latin American leaders, not to mention the population of Latin American countries, on the contrary, have historically had no love for Washington. The reason for the victory of such a peculiar candidate was the deep economic crisis that Argentina has been in for years. At the time of the election campaign, inflation in the country amounted to 140% and continued to grow. Moreover, the roots of this systemic problem, with which the past governments were unable to cope, go back to the early 90s, when neoliberal politicians, acting on orders from the U.S., took out unsustainable loans from the International Monetary Fund, which, on top of that, they successfully embezzled. Is it any wonder that in these conditions, some Argentines hoped for a miracle, which was promised to them by a man with a hairstyle like Elvis Presley, dashingly waving a chainsaw in public? However, a few months later it became clear that no miracle obviously did not work, and Milay himself turned out to be not such a radical libertarian as he portrayed himself to the voters. His team was largely made up of members of Argentina's political and economic elite who worked with former President Mauricio Macri and bear some of the blame for the country's economic problems. On their own, they could never have returned to power, but they managed to pull off the trick by hiding behind the non-systemic Javier. After his inauguration, Milay did indeed eliminate 10 of the 19 ministries, calling them parasitic entities on the country's body. However, the remaining government agencies are filled with time-tested bureaucrats from the Macri era who, according to the local opposition, are engaged in the same familiar business: corruption. The United States, busy with Ukraine and the Middle East, is in no hurry to provide Buenos Aires with any serious support, for which most likely there are simply no funds. Milay is not even given promises worthy of serious attention in this regard. And the idea of dollarizing Argentina also had to be abandoned, focusing on the struggle to hold the peso exchange rate. Javier Milay's main brainchild, a plan for total libertarian reforms in economic relations, labor law, the political system, and the penal code, recently failed in the Argentine parliament. Despite the fact that the president's emissaries had been doing preparatory work with members of Congress, Milay's radical rhetoric rallied the disparate Argentine opposition, which decided that a modern country still needs to have such structures as a Ministry of Labor and a Ministry of Culture. In addition, the Argentine opposition forces saw that Javier Milay's libertarian program was not aimed at decentralizing power. On the contrary, the new president with a chainsaw wanted to get his hands on huge powers. As a result, the deputies did not approve the initiatives of the apathetic president, and even actually forbade him to arbitrarily liquidate the bodies of state power. The government's problems began at the consideration of the chapter concerning the granting of special powers to the president, which allow him to take over the functions of the legislative body. The session rejected clauses that gave Milay the power to abolish government agencies without congressional approval. Now Milay is trying to pretend that the failure in Parliament was not a defeat at all, but a cunning plan. The version sounds, to put it mildly, unconvincing, considering how much effort Milay's ministers spent on negotiations with the opposition during these 2 months. The Argentine president has managed to quarrel with literally all representatives of local politicians. Meanwhile, inflation continues to rise, living standards are falling along with the authorities' ratings, and disgruntled Argentines are increasingly taking to the streets to protest. And although Milay has tried to limit the right to street rallies, which has traditionally been available to Argentina's powerful labor unions, this attempt has not been very successful either. Commentators expect that under these circumstances, the Argentine president may show political flexibility and try again to establish relations with the BRICS countries and China, whose weight in the region is steadily growing. Although after Milay's visit to the United States, his team abandoned the already agreed entry into the BRICS ranks. Buenos Aires's relations with the West cannot be called serene today either. British Foreign Secretary Cameron is planning to visit the Falkland Islands in person the other day, while Javier Milay makes it clear that he considers them sovereign Argentine territory, because this is the view shared by the vast majority of Argentinians. Thus, despite all the similarities, as of today, the Argentine president has not turned out to be Zelensky's political double. This is largely because the very political culture of Latin America prevents it.